Hello, and welcome to the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Professional Training Module on Refugee Communities in Minnesota. Information for Child Welfare Professionals. This is the first module in a series of 2 modules for child welfare professionals about refugee families in Minnesota and their experiences in the child protection system. The first module provides information on characteristics and experiences of the different refugee communities in Minnesota that is important for effective social work practice with families from these communities. The second module provides an overview of a specific quantitative study we conducted on the characteristics of and experiences of Somali and Oromo youth involved in Minnesota's child protection system. We are grateful for the financial support of federal Title IV-E funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. This module will begin with an overview of Minnesota's refugee population and provide specific information about the cultural and political backgrounds of Minnesota's largest refugee communities that is relevant to CPS workers who may engage with families from these communities. We will then present a discussion of the common pre-arrival, migration, resettlement, and acculturation experiences and accompanying stressors that can impact psychosocial well-being, social adjustment, and child maltreatment among refugee families. We will end with a brief review of the literature on the rate of involvement, outcomes of involvement, and experiences of refugee families with child protection services. In Part 1, we will present an overview of Minnesota's refugee communities and patterns of refugee resettlement in Minnesota in recent years. We will begin with defining what the term refugee means. Refugee is a legal immigration status defined in Section 101A.42 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. A refugee is a person who has crossed the border from their country to a second country seeking refuge from persecution. The term refugee refers to a legal immigration status that applies to individuals who have been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution based on 5 factors: their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. According to a UN High Commission on Refugees report in June 2017, there are currently 22.5 million refugees worldwide. After crossing the border from their home countries, refugees generally gather in camps in the second countries, awaiting a solution to their situation. There are generally 3 options available to refugees. They can wait until the persecution in their own country has ended and return to their homes. They can integrate into their country of refuge, or they can be resettled into a third country, usually a Western country in Europe or North America. The UN High Commission on Refugees is responsible for most refugee situations and works with refugee camps and receiving countries to resettle refugees. Refugee resettlement in the U.S. is overseen by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. ORR determines with Congress the number of refugees accepted into the U.S. each year. Along with 10 voluntary resettlement agencies throughout the country, ORR decides where refugees will be sent to live. Generally, refugees are reunited with families or resettled in cities in which a similar ethnic community already exists. This map shows the number of refugees resettled in the U.S. per state from 2001 to 2016. Note that Minnesota resettled between 40,000 and 50,000 refugees during this time period. Similar to the numbers resettled in Washington State and Florida, yet Minnesota's overall population is considerably smaller than either of these 2 states. Minnesota has one of the highest rates of refugee resettlement per capita in the United States. During fiscal year 2016, the United States accepted 84,995 refugees for resettlement, of which 2,335 were resettled in Minnesota. The largest number of refugees arriving in Minnesota over the last decade have come from Somalia and Burma. Iraq, Ethiopia, and Bhutan were the countries of origin with the third, fourth, and fifth highest numbers of refugees arriving during this period. Refugees from Burma belong to the ethnic Karen minority. Those arriving from Ethiopia are ethnic Oromos. In this table, the former Soviet Union refers to refugees from Belarus, Russia, Moldova, and Ukraine. This pie chart details the countries of origin of primary refugee arrivals to Minnesota during one single year, 2015. The pattern of refugee arrivals in 2015 is consistent with the overall numbers seen in the previous slide. The largest group of refugees arrived from Somalia, then Burma, Iraq, Ethiopia, and Bhutan. This map indicates which counties in Minnesota received primary refugee arrivals in 2015. Ramsey County received the largest number of arrivals, 1,156, followed by Hennepin, which received 404, Stearns, which received 232, and Olmsted, which received 98. Some refugees are settling in rural communities where factories are located that can offer immediate employment. These graphs illustrate the 4 counties with the largest number of arrivals of refugees in 2015. Each graph shows the distribution of refugees by country of origin resettling in each county. Ramsey County sees a high number of Burmese arrivals, indicated by the light purple bar, and a much smaller proportion of Somali, Bhutanese, and other groups. The largest number of Somali refugees are resettled in Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and Stearns counties, indicated by the orange bar. Many of the Iraqi arrivals have resettled in Olmsted County, indicated by the aqua blue colored bar in the graph on the bottom right. This graph illustrates the proportion of refugees resettled in Minnesota in 2015 by age. A substantial proportion of refugees resettling in Minnesota are children. In 2015, children under the age of 15 made up 43% of refugees resettled in Minnesota. Secondary refugee arrivals are refugees who were originally resettled in another state in the U.S. and then moved to Minnesota. This table shows that secondary refugees who reported their arrival to the Minnesota Department of Health, Hennepin and Kandiyohi counties received the largest numbers of reported secondary refugees, and Somalis were by far the largest group. Secondary arrivals are not eligible for the services and benefits provided to first arrivals via the U.S. Refugee Program. In Part 2, we will provide an overview of the specific cultural and political backgrounds of the 5 most populous refugee communities in Minnesota: the Karen from Burma, the Bhutanese, the Oromo from Ethiopia, the Somalis, and the Iraqis. Burma has an estimated population of 50 million people. About 50% are ethnic Burman, while the other half are made up of multiple minority ethnic groups. The Karen are the largest ethnic minority group in Burma, with a population of around 6 to 7 million. Burma gained independence from Britain in 1948. It was at that time that the Burmans gained control of the country and began to oppress and marginalize ethnic minority groups. These minority groups, including the Karen, have been fighting for autonomy within Burma since then. Burma is currently ruled by a military dictatorship, although some democratic reforms have begun to take hold, particularly since the elections of November 2015. The military government in Burma has perpetrated countless human rights abuses against the Karen, including rape, torture, imprisonment, forced relocation, and killing. Karen refugees have been fleeing into Thailand to escape persecution since 1980. There are 9 camps along the Thai-Burma border. Some refugees have lived in camps for 25 years. The camps are closed, meaning refugees are not allowed to leave the camps for any reason. If they are caught outside the camps, they can be deported back to Burma. Refugees receive basic shelter, food, health care, and schooling in the camps, but the lack of freedom and the length of time they have been living in camps can lead to psychological and social strain. As of 2015, approximately 68,000 Karen refugees had been resettled in the U.S. In Burma, most Karen were subsistence farmers and lived in small villages. Only 1 in 4 students studied beyond primary school, but many Karen in Thai refugee camps have some exposure to English. Approximately 89% of Karen are Christian and 11% are Buddhist, but many Karen incorporate animist beliefs into their religious practices. Karen families are small, with an average of 2 to 3 children. Here are some links to additional informational resources on the Karen. In 1960, British Somalia and Italian Somalia gained independence from their respective colonial powers and merged to form the Somali Republic. The country ran smoothly and democratically for some time, but by the late 1960s, the government was viewed as corrupt and inefficient. In 1969, the president was assassinated, and the military, under the leadership of General Siad Barre, took control of the government. Initially, Barre's government enjoyed popular support, but by the late 1980s, the government became increasingly resistant to opposition, and the once egalitarian country became highly stratified. Society became polarized into clan groups, with some clans resisting the government and the government cracking down on opposition. In 1991, the government collapsed and a vacuum was formed, while clans fought for power of the country, and it slipped into anarchy. By the early 1990s, 45% of the population had been displaced due to violence, disease, and famine. Somalia did not have an internationally recognized central government until January 2013. In February 2017, new federal elections were successfully carried out for the first time since the new government was established. However, up to 1/3 of the country is currently under the control of a militant group, Al-Shabaab. Although the Somali government and African Union troops have been successful in pushing Al-Shabaab out of the capital, Mogadishu, and other major population centers, the group continues to control large parts of central and southern Somalia and continues to carry out terrorist attacks, restricting humanitarian efforts. Additionally, since 2016, Somalia has been in the grips of a severe drought, making political, social, and health conditions increasingly dire. Somali civilians have been caught in the middle of a chaotic and violent struggle for control of Somalia. Somali refugees report a torture exposure rate of 36%, and an estimated 25% suffer with trauma-related PTSD and major depression. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees, In 2016, there were over 2.5 million registered Somali refugees and Somalis living in refugee-like situations worldwide. Most Somali refugees flee to refugee camps in neighboring countries, particularly Kenya and Ethiopia, to await resettlement. The UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that over half of all Somali refugees worldwide are residing in temporary refugee camps. Although camps are meant to be temporary, some Somalis have lived in them for decades. Somalis have been immigrating to the United States since the 1920s, and the recent wave of refugees are not the first Somalis in Minnesota. Over the last 3 decades, 90,000 Somali refugees have migrated to the U.S., with just over 42,000 residing in Minnesota. Somalis have established a large and vibrant community in Minneapolis and have established businesses, schools, and centers to serve their community. Despite the presence of an established, resettled community, Somalis continue to experience social, mental, and physical health disparities. Somali society is organized into ancestral clans which serve as a great source of both solidarity and conflict, with membership in a clan determined by the father's lineage. Family is extremely important in Somalia. In a Somali home, the father is traditionally the wage earner and decision maker for the family and represents the family in public. If the father is absent, this role is usually passed on to an older male relative. Women in Somali families have significant influence in the home, and their status is elevated by the number of children they have. Somali women typically marry and have children early, and families are generally large. Children are highly valued in Somali culture. Traditionally, spanking is considered an acceptable discipline practice in Somali families. Somalis have 3-part names. The first name is often the name of a grandparent. The second is the name of the child's father, and the third name is the name of the child's paternal grandfather. Somalis are identified by their first and second names, and women do not change their name after marriage. Most Somalis arriving in Minnesota are Sunni Muslims, and the practice of Islam is an integral part of life. According to Islamic traditions, women and men do not touch members of the opposite sex outside the family, such as shaking hands. Additionally, women must cover their bodies, including their hair, although most Somali women do not wear a full face veil. The Somali language is universally spoken in the Somali community, with Arabic a common second language. Unlike some new refugee communities, the Somali community in Minnesota is long established. Children who came to the U.S. at a very young age, or who were born here to refugee parents, may identify more with American culture. Cultural gaps between generations can be significant in this community. Here are some additional resources on the Somali community in Minnesota. Now we will discuss Oromo refugees from Ethiopia. The Oromo are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, with a population of 30 million. The Oromo claim an original homeland, called Oromia, within what is now Ethiopia. Under Ethiopia's current ruling government, the Oromo have experienced severe political and social oppression, including the banning of their language and cultural practices. The government is responsible for the torture of Oromo dissidents, sexual violence against Oromo women and men, and extrajudicial executions. To prevent the resistance, the government has instituted a widespread culture of surveillance of communication and a crackdown on free press and freedom of association. In the 1980s, almost 2 million refugees fled Ethiopia, and by the 1990s, there were almost 500,000 Ethiopians in the United States. It is difficult to estimate the number of Oromo refugees worldwide because statistics are compiled by country of origin, in this case Ethiopia, rather than ethnicity. Similarly, it is difficult to estimate the number of Oromo in Minnesota, although most agree it is the largest population in the U.S. Estimates of the population range from between 10,000 by the Minnesota State Demographer's Office and more than 40,000 according to the Oromo Cultural Institute of Minnesota. Oromos typically live in extended family households. Oromo society is typically patriarchal, with men making the majority of decisions and solving disputes. Family and kinship are central to Oromo society. Oromos are Christian and Muslim, and some maintain the traditional Oromo religious belief in one God, called Wakwa. Oromifa is the language of the Oromo people. This language was banned during the regime of Selassie in the 1960s and 1970s, during which time only Amharic was taught in schools. Thus many Oromo who attended schools during this time also speak Amharic, but prefer to speak Oromifa. Here are additional resources about the Oromo community. Next, we will discuss the historical background and cultural practices of Bhutanese refugees. Since 1991, more than 100,000 refugees have fled Bhutan. There are three main ethnic groups in Bhutan. The Lhotshampas are of Nepali origin and primarily live in southern Bhutan, close to Nepal. Southern Bhutanese speak Nepali and are primarily Hindu. In the 1980s, the Bhutanese began to perceive the southern Bhutanese as a threat to their power and instituted a series of policies that discriminated against them. The Bhutanization of Bhutan involved outlawing the Nepali language and southern Bhutanese cultural practices and stripping many southern Bhutanese of their citizenship. When the southern Bhutanese demonstrated and organized against these changes, the Bhutanese government instituted a brutal crackdown. Several thousand people were imprisoned and many were tortured. Amnesty International declared that the Bhutanese government instituted a systematic removal of the Lhotshampas from Bhutan. Bhutanese refugees were not permitted to seek refuge in neighboring India and had to continue on to Nepal. In 1991, at the request of the Nepali government, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees established 7 refugee camps in the southeastern lowlands of Nepal. By 2007, the year when the formal resettlement of Bhutanese refugees began, there were 108,000 refugees living in the Nepali camps. In 2015, just 2 refugee camps remained, with a combined population of 18,000. Because refugee families moved to camps in the early 1990s, but resettlement did not begin until 2008, many of the Bhutanese refugees are children who have never lived outside the camps. Because of the protracted nature of the situation in the camps, conditions have deteriorated. Refugees are no longer allowed to seek employment outside the camps. NGOs report depression, suicide, alcohol and drug abuse, school dropout, and gender-based violence increasing in the camps. As of 2016, over 90,000 Bhutanese refugees have been resettled in the U.S., with approximately 400 Bhutanese refugees currently living in Minnesota. The Bhutanese in Minnesota speak Nepali, with approximately 35% knowing some English. Bhutanese generally live in multi-generational homes and families, which are traditionally patriarchal, with the father acting as the main decision maker. The majority of Bhutanese in Minnesota are Hindu, but approximately a quarter are Buddhist. Bhutanese have an extremely high regard for education, and children are expected to work hard, study, and do well in school. In the refugee camps, no early childhood education was available, and free education ended at 9th grade. Here are additional resources on Bhutanese refugees. The final group we will discuss are Iraqi refugees. In the late 1960s, the Ba'ath Party gained control of Iraq, and in 1979, Saddam Hussein became president of Iraq. The Ba'ath Party was a socialist, nationalist party that has been accused of perpetrating massive human rights violations against its opponents, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. The U.S. has fought 2 wars with Iraq. The first war was precipitated by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Kuwait had provided loans to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, and disagreements over repayment of those loans led to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. In 1991, the U.S. launched an operation to liberate Kuwait. At the same time, Shias in the south launched an uprising against the Ba'ath regime. The regime responded with brutal retaliation. The second war with Iraq was precipitated by the attacks on the U.S. of September 11, 2001. The U.S. had attempted to remove Saddam Hussein in the past, and the war on terror provided a motivation to invade Iraq to remove the Ba'ath Party. Although the war has been declared over, Iraq has struggled to maintain law and order since the U.S. invasion. The situation has become more dire with the rise of the terrorist group ISIS, or ISIL, which captured control of key cities of Fallujah, Mosul, and Tikrit in 2014. The rise of ISIS has led to a civil war between Iraqi government forces, with some support from the U.S., and ISIS fighters for control of the country. In 2015, Iraqi government forces retook control of the cities of Tikrit and Ramadi. In July 2017, after over 6 months of fighting, the Iraqi army captured Mosul from ISIS. More than 19,000 Iraqi civilians were killed in ISIS-linked violence between January 2014 and October 2015. Violence, insecurity, and crushing poverty remain significant issues in Iraq. According to the UN High Commission on Refugees, in 2016, there were 350,998 Iraqi refugees worldwide. The UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that over 4 million Iraqis have been displaced during the wars and violence in Iraq over the last 15 years. Of these, about 2 million have found asylum in neighboring countries, where many eke out a marginal living in poor inner-city neighborhoods, often by working illegally for low wages as laborers, drivers, and restaurant workers. After the 1991 Gulf War, 12,000 Iraqis were allowed into the U.S. Since then, the Iraqi refugee population, has been rapidly growing. Unlike other refugees, most Iraqi refugees do not live in camps, but in major cities. Therefore, they lack some of the resources and supports available in traditional camps. Medical and social services in the host countries are limited. Finding legal employment is extremely difficult. Iraqi youth face many barriers to accessing education in host countries. Many refugees have experienced rape, torture, kidnapping, blackmail, and imprisonment in Iraq. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees has found that Iraqi refugees have extremely high levels of trauma, higher than is typical for other refugee populations. Most Iraqi refugees are either Sunni or Shiite Muslim, with a small minority being Christian. Sunni and Shias follow the same basic tenets of Islam and differ mostly on one main point. Sunnis believe the successors to the Prophet Muhammad must be chosen on the basis of merit, whereas Shiites believe the successors must be direct descendants of the Prophet himself, through his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali. There are other differences between the two groups, including the role of clergy and their relationship to the state. The Sunnis are a minority in Iraq, and there has been a continued struggle for power between Sunnis and Shiites. The Sunnis were favored by the British and received a majority in government roles during British occupation. Since 2003 and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, who was also a Sunni, Sunnis have been excluded from government positions, and the Shiites now dominate. Iraqi refugees resettling in the U.S. frequently face anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiments, which can make resettlement difficult. Iraqis consider family unity and honor to be extremely important. In many Iraqi families, women hold a great deal of power, but in public often have less power than men. Traditionally, women are responsible for taking care of the children and the elderly in the family, and move in with their husbands' families upon marriage. Arabic is the universal language of Iraq, but with more than 15 dialects spoken, this can pose a challenge for arranging interpreters for Iraqi refugees. Many Iraqi refugees are well-educated professionals. However, their professional credentials are often not recognized in the U.S., making it difficult for them to work in their fields or in jobs that are at the same professional level as what they held in Iraq. This loss of professional identity and its accompanying financial strain and decrease in social status can make adjustment to life in the U.S. particularly difficult. Here are additional resources regarding Iraqi refugees. In Part 3, we will discuss experiences during the process of refugee migration and resettlement that are shared across groups of refugees, regardless of country of origin. The purpose of giving this information is to contextualize the experiences and potential vulnerabilities of new refugee families in resettlement. Understanding of these experiences and potential vulnerabilities is crucial for child welfare workers who may come into contact with refugee families. Scholars have described the impact of the refugee experience by referring to 3 stages that affect all refugees' adjustment in resettlement. What refugees experience pre-flight, during flight, and in the refugee camps continue to impact them once they are resettled. It is important to note, however, that individual experiences and the effects of these experiences depend on the specific economic, social, and cultural conditions in each phase of the refugee experience, as well as the unique characteristics of each individual. The pre-flight period refers to the experiences that refugees face in the home country and the time leading up to the decision to flee. By definition, refugees are people who have fled persecution in their country of origin and are unable to return. Thus, regardless of country of origin, the pre-flight period for refugees is one that is characterized by socio-political violence, oppression, and unrest. Many of the home countries of refugees in the U.S. have a long history of war and socio-political conflicts, during which refugees experience torture, rape, arbitrary detentions, seizure of property, ongoing surveillance, murder, execution, and disappearances. A 2005 meta-analysis by Porter and Haslam estimated that between 5% and 35% of refugees endure torture. Other experiences can include physical and sexual violence, witnessing death, detention, forced labor, economic deprivation, food shortage, illness and malnutrition, curtailment of rights such as freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, and arbitrary arrests. All of these tactics are by governments and groups in power to perpetuate fear and induce feelings of powerlessness. Experiences of war trauma and torture have been shown to be associated with psychosocial problems in refugee populations that can have negative impacts on family functioning. This slide provides the rates of torture among Minnesota's largest refugee groups. Torture refers to an act committed by a person acting under the color of law, specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental pain or suffering, other than pain or suffering incidental to lawful sanctions, upon another person within his custody or physical control. Severe mental pain or suffering refers to the prolonged mental harm caused by or resulting from the intentional infliction or threatened infliction of severe physical pain or suffering, the administration or application or threatened administration or application of mind-altering substances or other procedures calculated to disrupt profoundly the senses or the personality, the threat of imminent death, or the threat that another person will imminently be subjected to death, severe physical pain or suffering, or the administration or application of mind-altering substances or other procedures calculated to disrupt profoundly the senses or personality. The period of flight is the experience of migration from the home country to the country of first asylum. Refugees often leave their home country with little preparation, on foot, and with few provisions. Refugees may walk for weeks or months to get to safety. Refugees are also commonly separated from family members during this period. A statement of a Mozambican refugee interviewed in 1991 describes this experience. My own house was burning as I ran from it, leaving all my possessions behind. All my family managed to get away, but we were separated in the confusion. Over the next few days we were gradually reunited, and we then began to travel towards the border. We took quiet routes by day and hid in the bush at night. The reception phase is the time a refugee spends in limbo in the first country of asylum. All refugees have crossed an international border. They often seek shelter in a camp or urban area and register with the UN High Commission on Human Rights, who may provide some basic relief items. While in the camps, refugees continue to face a lack of safety. Women are also vulnerable to sexual violence in this stage, especially if they must leave the camp, for example, to collect firewood. Refugees who often do not have documents to live legally in the country of asylum also face a continued fear of deportation back to their home country. Refugee camp conditions are often characterized by poor sanitation, poor access to nutritious food, poor health care, and limited educational and employment opportunities. There are health consequences associated with prolonged asylum. The High Commission on Refugees defines a protracted refugee situation as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or longer in any given asylum country. Currently, 2/3 of refugees have lived in protracted refugee situations for more than 5 years. Finally, because refugees are unable to leave the camp or work legally in an area, they are forced to be dependent on outside aid to meet their basic needs. To the extent that refugees are excluded from decision-making that affects their lives, this may also facilitate attitudes of learned helplessness, which may increase the likelihood of depression. The goal of the U.S. Resettlement Program is that refugees will become economically self-sufficient as soon as possible after they arrive. All refugees are assigned to a voluntary agency who provides initial reception and placement services, which include pre-arrival preparations for new families. With legal status, refugees are also eligible for public services and assistance upon their arrival. While each refugee group has a unique historical, cultural, and political context, there are some similarities among refugee groups. Most refugees have fled horrific experiences in their home countries and are at increased risk of developing PTSD and depression. Most refugees fled with little more than their own clothing. Many refugees are separated from their family members and spend months or years with no knowledge of where their families are. Many refugees wait for years in camps to either resettle in a new country or return to their homes. Many refugee camps are overcrowded and dangerous, and refugees often lack food or sanitary conditions. Some refugees are unable to leave camps to find work or go to school. Many refugee youth have significant gaps in their education. When refugees arrive in their new countries, they frequently arrive with very little knowledge of their new country or the language and have few translatable employable skills. Refugees are given 90 days of social services upon arrival and 8 months of financial and medical support. In addition to the traumas experienced in their countries of origin, research has found that refugee families experience significant stressors related to their resettlement and acculturation processes that can impact their family functioning and parenting practices. Many of these stressors are identified as risk factors for involvement with CPS in the general population. For example, language barriers. English is not the first language of the vast majority of refugees resettled in the U.S. Limited English proficiency can prevent refugee parents from finding employment, interacting with other communities, communicating with their children's school, and obtaining access to other financial, social, and medical resources. Discrimination. In the U.S., refugees may experience racial, religious, or cultural discrimination. In addition to the potential impacts of discrimination on employment, housing, health, and social status, studies have found that even perceived discrimination negatively impacts the mental health and resettlement success of refugees. Some refugees may be more vulnerable to discrimination than others. A 2009 study by Hadley and Patil found that East African refugees experience greater discrimination than those arriving from Eastern Europe. Social isolation. Refugees have left their home communities, in which they may have had deep social ties and connections that cannot be easily recreated upon their arrival to the U.S. In addition to the emotional and psychological stress, social isolation also results in the loss of informal child monitoring networks that may have been present in their communities of origin. Changing family and gender roles. Refugee families often experience stress from changing family and gender roles, resulting from different social norms in their new countries, employment opportunities, or lack thereof, and differences in language acquisition and acculturation among parents and children. In a number of studies, Somali refugee parents in Australia, Sweden, and the UK have described feeling a loss of parenting authority and control over their young children and teenagers. Loss of occupational credentials. Upon arriving in the U.S., some refugees learn that the educational or vocational training they received in their countries of origin is not considered valid for similar positions in the U.S. Thus, some refugees may have to settle for jobs that are lower skilled and lower paid, resulting in both increased financial stress to the family and psychological stress as adults may lose their professional identities. Poverty. In a study by Capps and colleagues from 2004, young children in immigrant families were found to experience higher rates of poverty than their native-born counterparts. Although refugee families receive resettlement support and services upon arrival to the U.S., these supports are time-limited and narrowly focused. Refugee families are only eligible for financial support through the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program for 8 months post-arrival, down from an initial 3-year support when the program was established in 1980. And finally, health and mental health needs. Due to the trauma they experienced in their countries of origin, once settled in the U.S., many refugees face ongoing health and mental health needs. An Office of Refugee Resettlement meta-analysis of 181 surveys of over 80,000 refugees from 40 different countries found prevalence rates of 30% for PTSD and depression. Torture experiences and cumulative exposure to trauma were the strongest factors associated with PTSD. Although migration and resettlement involve significant challenges, refugee families also possess strengths and protective factors that can support psychological well-being, social adjustment, and positive family functioning. As previously discussed, families with refugee status have had to navigate extraordinarily dangerous conditions in their countries of origin and during their migration to the U.S. Their ability to keep their children safe and their families intact under these incredibly trying conditions is a significant strength. Additionally, refugee families demonstrate resiliency, resourcefulness, and a strong commitment to their children by choosing migration from their home countries in order to provide their children with a better future. Although they had to leave social connections in their countries of origin, many refugees develop strong social connections within the refugee communities in the U.S. These communities provide strong social supports for many families. For some refugee families, traditional religious or cultural values can be protective against potential sources of child abuse. For example, Plummer and Jaguna's 2009 study found that traditional Somali cultural and religious values, such as prohibitions against physical interaction between genders and the use of alcohol and drugs, sex and gender taboos, and the importance of maintaining virginity before marriage, protected against certain types of abuse. It is clear from the previous sections that refugees' complicated histories of political and cultural trauma, combined with the stress of building a new life in an unfamiliar culture, could negatively impact family functioning and contribute to possible need for child welfare system involvement. However, it is important to consider what the scholarly research has found regarding the issue of refugees and child protection involvement. This section will review the current small literature on this issue. There is currently very little research on the experience of refugees in the child protection system. Some research has been done to examine the experiences of immigrants in general. However, these results themselves have been mixed, with some reporting overrepresentation and some underrepresentation among CPS cases. Verica, Kuhn, and Kapp's 2007 study on patterns of Hispanic children's involvement in CPS found that first and second generation Hispanic families were underrepresented in CPS, while third or higher generations were overrepresented. The authors also found that first and second generation Hispanic immigrants were more likely to be placed in group homes or institutions and to have long-term goals of foster care or independent living, and were less likely to be placed with relatives or have goals of family reunification. Though scant quantitative research exists on the proportion of refugees involved in CPS, and a number of qualitative studies, refugees have identified challenges to working with CPS, including a lack of cultural competence among CPS workers, a lack of knowledge about immigration status and resettlement challenges, a lack of language support and the use of children to interpret for CPS meetings, and the placement of children in out-of-home settings that did not have language support. Parents also identified challenges with understanding their rights in the U.S. CPS system and described feeling scared, powerless, vulnerable, and silenced when interacting with CPS. Another major barrier that occurs when refugee individuals and families become involved with child protective services include issues with workers and the system in general. Many workers lack knowledge about language, cultural, and immigrant resettlement status, and these have proven to be barriers among this population. Refugees oftentimes struggle with similar issues that have been identified as risk factors for U.S.-born individuals involved in child protection. Some of these risk factors include, but are not limited to, social isolation, poverty, stressful life events, and unstable employment. Evidence suggests that some refugee families may be referred to CPS for problems related to low incomes, inability to access social service systems, and a culture of stress rather than abuse. A lack of official guidance and inadequate funding inhibit resettlement agencies from broad consultation with local systems, and significant training needs remain related to CPS workers' knowledge about refugees' migration experiences and cultural backgrounds. We hope that this module has provided you with useful information about the refugee experience and the historical and cultural backgrounds of Minnesota's major refugee communities. There is a clear need for more research on the rate of involvement, outcomes of involvement, and unique experiences of refugee communities in the child protection system. The second module in this series presents the results of a quantitative exploratory study on the involvement of Somali and Oromo youth in Minnesota's child protection system.